Good morning, everyone. So it's really a great pleasure to present you in this latest Foresight conference, which is becoming a big tradition at our institute. So at the beginning of the conference, probably, it's a good idea to talk a little bit about Foresight, so we come to the same level of understanding, and we actually see how we have evolved with the use and practice of Foresight, where we are currently, and then what futures exist for Foresight from our perspective. So this is a joint presentation by myself, my colleague Professor Sokolov, and Professor Ian Miles from our institute. Actually, we are still and increasingly concerned about the future. So just to remind why we are concerned about the future is that we have limited resources. We have limited time, we have limited skills, we have limited money, and we are living in a very fast changing world. So we need to use these limited resources as wisely as possible to enable innovation, to think out of the box, to set priorities, because we cannot possibly invest in everything at the same time, so we have to make some strategic choices for that, to build some long-term visions, and then to formulate some strategies to get there. Meanwhile, to bring all the different stakeholders together, to link them, to establish some systems so that they can operate with each other. As we live in a very fast-changing world, it's also very important to identify those weak signals of future changes. So what might happen in the future? And wildcards, which we start actually seeing more and more frequently in our lives. Those unexpected events which may actually occur at any time and then create big changes. We have seen a number of them through the world, like 21st century wars, disasters, elections, referendums, and every day actually we are operating in a different landscape in the world. So it's very important to make strategic decisions and strategic choices with a long-term perspective. It is actually important to understand what is changing. So this is one of the most frequently slides I use in my presentations, and it is actually still valid in many ways, because changes are happening at many different levels in our lives. So our world is changing, society, technology, economy, environment, politics, and culture, so these are not fixed. These are changing on a very fast and on a very daily basis. So we really need to understand how our society is changing, how our economy is changing, how our environment is changing. And we need to kind of understand this dynamic change and develop similar dynamic approaches for this changing context. And there's also the way we look into the future, so which is represented as an internal context in this picture. So it actually is the way we look at things, we perceive things from our points of views. And these points of views are defined by our motivations, behaviors, our own culture, politics, power, and skills, a number of things actually which shape the way we look at the world, we anticipate the future, and then we formulate our actions. So the reflection of this in Foresight is in terms of the context where Foresight is embedded, and the content, those areas that we choose to focus on. You see that actually these areas are also changing very fast. So we have seen in Catherine's presentation that we are more focusing on biotechnologies, nanotechnologies, and other technologies, but at the same time some more cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary fields like sustainable development, for example, climate change. And we have all sorts of grand challenges to deal with, which require some multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, and sometimes anti-disciplinary approaches. And we change the way we do foresight in line with this. So there's a change in the process and methodology of foresight, which I will talk about a little bit. As I said, first of all, we need to understand the dynamics of the world and how things are changing. So first of all, we increasingly face a growing demand for products and services in the world. But meanwhile, our resources are getting scarce. So we are using more water, more food, more energy, more natural resources, and these are expected to increase 50 to 100% in the next couple of decades. By 2050, we will need 60% of more water, 50% of more food, and how to generate this is our big question and grand challenge. Because the resources are getting limited, so they are gaining more value. So we need to actually invest more in order to obtain them, in order to get them, because they are finite and they are shared. And these are all given rise to problems like sustainability, security, and with all sorts of social, economic, and political consequences. But at the same time, we have opportunities. Like we are going more technological. There are a lot of advancements in science, technology, and innovation, and we are seeing that public and private companies are more and more interested in investing R&D and providing a lot of opportunities for us to address these challenges. So we are not in a hopeless situation. We have actually means to adapt ourselves to these changing situations as we did in the past. If you haven't read the Limits to Growth book, which was written in the 1970s, it was saying that by 2020, actually, we would exhaust all our resources and the humanity would come to an end. But it didn't happen. So we have adapted ourselves to these changing situations, and we will adapt ourselves to future changing situations, but we need to understand their nature and develop proper means of intervening into them. We have in the world, set up a set of ambitious goals for 2030. So these are sustainable development goals, which were agreed and accepted by 173 countries in the world. So if you look at their agenda, they try to address these questions from one or multiple perspectives, because they may have different implications for different countries and different continents, but we have these common and big goals, and they require a lot of work and a lot of advancements. So we are doing foresight within this sort of context, where we have a lot of pressures, a lot of constraints, challenges, and at the same time, a lot of possibilities. Foresight, actually, within this context, has evolved over time. So I try to generate some kind of a timeline of how foresight is changing. Because foresight is changing as the world changes. And the world changes as foresight provides some new tools and techniques. So it is not actually by coincidence that every decade almost we have seen some changes and advancements in the way we do foresight. First of all, foresight is in our nature. So we actually have this, we do it, the act of anticipation is part of our characteristic as humans. But doing this in a kind of a more institutional way is a later practice. So we started using our collective intelligence, collective way of looking into the future, and institutionalized this sort of activity starting from the 50s, and we added different features into that. So we started bringing some experts together. They were looking into the future of technology, but later, for example, in the 70s, we realized that there are economic concerns also in the world. So it's not only the technology. We should focus on the economy at the same time. And we are living in a more uncertain and more complex world which cannot be predicted. As we moved to the 80s, for example, we started seeing the use of innovation systems, because we realized that actually it's not only one actor's initiative to make change happen. So we need to bring actors and stakeholders and different parties together. So that's why we started talking about innovation systems, participatory approaches, inclusive approaches, and not only to obtain some reports looking into the future, but also doing this through some mutual learning and collective visioning processes where all actors and stakeholders come together and build a common future. And then we started seeing that this tool of foresight has been accepted and widely used by governments, for example, industry and other organizations. It has been accepted as a formal way of formulating policies. And then as we came to 2000s, we started seeing that we should also include society. Society is a big player, big partner, not only on the demand side, but also there's an important element of innovation from the social side. And then we started focusing on grand challenges with the increasing likelihood of all sorts of wildcards. We started seeing that it is not only to develop visions for the next 20, 30 years, because actually any strategies we develop change a lot on the way. So we need to have more dynamic and adaptive foresight approaches because the context is continuously changing and we need to adapt our strategies within this changing context. A government is changing, for example, and the new government is not committed to sustainable development as the previous one, but we still have this big expectation, sustainable development goals, so what to do with that? So we need to have more dynamic and adaptive strategies by counting these immediate changes, unexpected changes, and develop some more resilient approaches. And in the future, we see that there are exciting developments, all sorts of artificial intelligence, machines, robots, and then integrated use with humans. So we need to actually count these developments also in the way we think about the future and formulate the future. We have a number of tools we use for foresight methods. So you see that at the beginning, in the early 90s, we were using one or two methods in foresight, but our methodological toolbox has really expanded a lot. Now we are using over 50 methods actually in foresight, and we are integrating them in all different ways. So we are using some methods to understand the world, understand this change, and then explore futures, prioritize areas, and develop strategies. So we started using some more and more integrated and multi-approach processes in foresight. So in our recent work with Alexander Sokolov and Ian Miles, we have actually suggested a process, a kind of a framework for foresight. This is not looking or saying like anything about the domains where foresight is applied, because foresight is simply applied everywhere. And this is focusing mainly on the core functions and core phases of thinking about the future. It all begins with the initiation of the activity and gathering intelligence about our current state and our futures. This is through scanning, environmental scanning, horizon scanning, to understand actually the world we operate in. There's the imaginative and creative part where we expand our points of views and we try to kind of explore futures. And then there's the vision building phase, which is about the integration, and the interpretation phase, which is about developing strategies to achieve those visions. So translating these visions into strategies, long, medium, and short terms. And then intervention is making things happen from today. So if we don't start from today, it will be too late. If you develop some kind of a roadmap between now and the future, you will see that we don't have a lot of time and we need to act very soon and from today. Then we do an impact assessment of what we are doing, what we have been doing, and as a part of this dynamic and adaptive approach, we need to change our approaches, sometimes revise our visions, sometimes revise the way we do things. So there's a very important phase of impact assessment. And all this process happens in an interactive process with the engagement of all stakeholders. So these are like 7+1 eyes of foresight. We use a number of methods for different phases of this activity. So you see that our methodological toolbox is again very big, and new methods can be added into this process at any time. We can be very creative about adding methods and then integrating them with each other and then using different sources, processing them in different ways. So these are some suggested methods which can be grouped in various ways, like some processes of foresight activity, some quantitative methods or semi-quantitative methods, and then some qualitative methods. So some of these methods could be performed by some machines, the others can be performed by humans, and we try to actually bring this two together. And we will have more means of achieving this. So there are so many different technologies developing. We can see that actually for each of the phases of foresight, we can use these developing technologies. So if you look at how foresight was performed actually in the inner circle, so we used to bring some experts together around the table. We read some of the literature. We used our flip charts, 3 Ps of foresight, pen, poster, and post-its. So we are still using actually this, but we have some other tools and more advanced tools to improve our foresight. So you can see that we are now moving. We are moving out. And we can already analyze large amounts of data and visualize and represent them in various ways. So this increases our evidence for foresight. So we are not only dependent on a group of experts, which could be biased or which could be limited and things, but big data opened us a lot of new opportunities, for example, gathering and analyzing data. We have all sorts of social networking tools, for example, that we can engage society, people, different stakeholders on a real-time basis. We can really collect their opinion and then analyze these opinions. And in the near future, we'll have all sorts of different methods like blockchain, for example, which could be used for decision-making and in terms of enabling participation and verifying information and then distributing this to large amount of stakeholders. So there are a lot of possibilities there. And we have new means of processing this data. We have more use of artificial intelligence, and Professor Honoral, for example, will tell later about how she actually develops in her lab some brain-to-brain communication systems, which would actually bring us all sorts of new opportunities in terms of communicating with each other and then creating the future together in a much more interactive way. What is interesting in all these pictures is that if you look at outside to the edges of the picture, you see that we are going to a network society. We are networking people, we are networking satellites, sensors, we are networking machines, we are actually networking humans and machines together. So there's the Internet of Things, for example, technology, but we are moving into Internet of Everything because there will be possibilities to integrate human brain into these systems at the same time. And we are going into a more and more connected society and connected technologies. And society and technologies will also be connected. So we need to understand and manage the dynamics of this network society. And this will give us a lot of possibilities in the way we do and practice foresight. So we will be able to use, for example, these are the near-term developments. Social media and online, for example, participation. We will be able to engage different stakeholders. We will be able to gather data by using data mining and then find some new ways of eliciting information and knowledge, new ways of interacting with people and environment, not only probably only with humans, but also with machines and other living species we will be able to communicate because they will also be represented in our future projections. And we have new tools for modeling behaviors and then testing and understanding and adding the element of shocks and surprises into the system and looking at their consequences for the future. And there are more and more possibilities in terms of we present and visualize data. We share it with everybody, not only in written reports or text, but also by using all sorts of other media, as you can imagine. So there are a lot of new possibilities and new technologies in there. And also there are a lot of possibilities for monitoring change, because our aim is actually to change things, because we are not satisfied and we want to make them better, and we need to be able to see whether our decisions and strategies are making any change on our societies, on our environment, and we have continuously new monitoring technologies to observe this change. I will just give an example on a system that we have been developing in our institute, which is actually very much advanced now. So I will just give examples on how we make use of data, for example, now for our foresight activities. First of all, we need to understand that data is our major asset. Data is everywhere, all over the place. So data is in scientific publications, data is in patents, data is in a large number of reports and forecasts provided by a number of organizations, in conferences, news, experts, and at the same time, data is where funding is, for example. Data can be where the stock exchange is, or mergers and acquisitions. This, again, came into our agenda as we had some conversations. One of the best ways of understanding the future developments is to look at where the money is going, for example. Because if money is going into a certain direction or a certain technology, we may expect that some research will start, and then we will generate some outputs, which will start changing our lives. So it's always a good idea for that reason to look at funding, for example, where money is going, and which companies are becoming, for example, more valuable in the stock exchange, and which companies are buying which other companies. So why, for example, Google is investing in health, why Apple is investing in home technologies, why Amazon is going into food business. So there are actually all sorts of reasons for these companies going into these areas. We will see some consequences of this in the near future. So these are very useful source of information for us to look at. And we developed some quantitative and qualitative ways of using and analyzing this data, and I created our intelligence foresight analytics system, which we call as IFORA. So IFORA produces a number of results, so I will quickly show some examples of them. So you can see that we can map science and technology developments in different domains, and how dynamically actually these domains are changing and developing, going up or down. So you can see the case of energy, how solar cells are, for example, developing, how fuel cells are developing in a kind of more stable way, how fossil fuels are developing. So we can see actually where the research is going in these areas. So the dynamics of science and technology. We can see how the structural changes in science and technology take place. So if you look at the case of solar energy, you can see that this area is getting really wide and getting really big. And then there are some new areas emerging through the convergence of different fields or through the divergence of them. So this is kind of showing those scientific clusters under the area of the solar energy. So you see that actually it is getting really lively and really wide compared to only 5 years ago. So you can see how progressed actually the field, the scientific field of solar energy through 5 years. We can look at the dynamics of this change in terms of trends. So we can look at how, for example, frequently some terminologies are appearing, and we can see in the dynamics how fast they are growing. So if an area is fast and frequent, then we consider them as the main drivers of science and technology, like lithium-ion battery and graphene nanosheet, for example. And we can also map some of those mature areas. We can see some of those areas which are very fastly, rapidly increasing, but their occurrence intensity is low at the moment, and they can tell us some future weak signals. So we can see actually some more mentions and reference to those areas, or they may disappear, but they are definitely worth looking at. So we can do this sort of analysis with data. One of the important outputs of the system is also to bring different domains together and looking at the intersections between them. For example, in the case of medicine, there's you can see technological developments and diseases. We can see which technologies can be used to respond to what sorts of diseases. So we can actually match this and see how, for example, obesity can be tackled through preventive medicine, how breast cancer actually could be dealt with DNA sequencing, genetic engineering, nuclear medicine, and preventive medicine technologies. So we can actually see which technologies can be used to respond to what sorts of diseases. And again, I told already that grants are very important to look at, for example, and not only the grants, but how grants are translated into some research articles, after that some patents in terms of some products and services and technologies, and how they find their way into professional media to penetrate more into our lives. This is also a very valuable analysis in terms of showing, for example, machine learning. We see that grants are bigger. So the blue bubbles are showing these grants. So, and we see that actually there are some investments into this area. And in time, we started seeing over years, over 10 years, that this started finding more patents and then more place in media. So this is actually growing. And grants in this area still continue to be high. So we can see that actually this area will stay on the agenda for a while more. And this life cycle of science and technology areas actually tell a lot about the emergence of technologies and then their use, and which technologies actually might still stay in our radar for the next decade or two. We can see which science and technologies are in hypes or whether they are real. So sometimes we see a lot of mention of technologies in media, but they are not actually mentioned in any articles or patents. So we try to understand if there's one technology mentioned frequently in media, but has no article or patent related to that, so that's very likely that this could be a hype, because it's not supported by research. But at the same time, there are some areas which find a lot of mention in media, but at the same time supported by some articles and patents. So we may expect that actually there will be some more developments, and these are the promising areas. And there are some other areas where there are articles and patents, but there is no yet public awareness in media. So this will be some emerging areas which will find their ways later in our lives and will appear probably more in media at some point. And we can similarly do some kind of market assessments and do some forecasts, intelligent forecasts for the future, so we can try to look at the margins of, for example, markets or technologies, and we can have some kind of estimations which can show the limits. So the real picture probably will be somewhere in between. And one of the latest actually points that we have reached the production, automated production of reports, so which will actually which may be a technology which can make us jobless soon. So because we can now already bring some inputs together from all these processes and already summarize and present them in some text format. So this is already possible. I would like to conclude with the second mission of Foresight. So Foresight is not only about looking into the future. Foresight is also about analyzing wider impacts of technological and social change. Because all these technologies and changes and transformations will have some positive and negative implications for our lives. And one task of Foresight is actually to anticipate what sorts of changes these new technologies and developments might bring. So this is a poster which I had prepared with my colleague from Manchester, Dennis Lowridge, showing the connection between systems, foresight, and law. So we need to develop some law regulations before actually things occur or break out in a kind of more anticipatory fashion. So foresight is relevant to law and then regulation and standard making at the same time, and especially in a fast developing world, we need to anticipate those changes and implications in advance to make this system working without actually damaging our people and society. So we already see some signals that all of us looking into some kind of a device when we are on the street or in the metro, and very low kind of social interaction, and people are spending a lot of time for playing games and other things. So there are already some alarming actually developments for our society. So one of our jobs should be to anticipate this change and then take actions before it creates any harm. This happened in previous, for example, industrial revolutions. Industrial revolutions, yes, brought a lot of possibilities and opportunities for us, but at the same time created a lot of damages. For example, first industrial revolution, you can see slum days and many ill and suffered children. Second industrial revolution brought a lot of opportunities in terms of technologies, but at the same time created a lot of destruction in our lives. Third industrial revolution created all these big and enormous cities in the world with a lot of stress on natural resources and demographic change. And the fourth industrial revolution may bring some other consequences. So this is like a one day in the future, in Futurama, where there's a conflict between humans and robots and artificial intelligence. Elon Musk recently said that the third actual world war would be between artificial intelligence and human. So it is probably a good idea to start thinking about the technologies and consequences and then their developments and then what kind of impacts they may have for the future. There are also some unexpected consequences. For example, this security robot, which was considered to be better than a human guard because it never gets bored of its job. But we saw that actually at some point he suicided. So robots can also suicide. So this is an unexpected consequence of technology that we need to think about. So with this slide, I would like to finish my presentation. I also would like to give several references which you might be interested in reading. Thank you very much.